Picture this. A man walks slowly across a broken field and he's counting kings, not soldiers. Kings. He steps past one fallen body, then another, and every one of them wore a crown when the sun came up that morning. Around him the ground has been churned to black paste. Cloaks lie trampled into the mud. Ravens are already dropping out of a grey northern sky, and somewhere behind him his own men are too exhausted to cheer. They simply stand, leaning on their spears, watching him move through the wreckage of the largest army this island has seen in living memory. He does not smile. He has won, and yet he has the face of a man who understands exactly how close he came to losing everything. The man walking among the dead kings is Æthelstan. You have probably never heard his name. He rules the empty space between two giants of memory. His grandfather, Alfred the Great, the king every English child still learns about, and the Norman conquerors who would come more than a century later and rewrite the whole island in their own tongue. Between those two famous bookends, Æthelstan is a shadow, a footnote, a king most people could not name if you offered them gold to do it. And yet on this single day he did something neither Alfred nor the Normans ever managed. He took a scattering of rival kingdoms, feuding peoples and old blood grudges, and he forced them, in one afternoon of slaughter, to become the raw outline of a single country. We are told this was a glorious birth. The moment England began, trumpets, destiny, a nation rising clean out of the earth, the truth is stranger and darker. Because the men who kept the records of that age, careful monks who normally noted little more than harvests and the deaths of bishops, stopped writing in their usual flat voice when they reached this battle. They broke into poetry. They wrote of a field carpeted with the fallen, of blades that never rested, 5 kings and 7 great warlords left lying in the dirt. It was, they said, the bloodiest day the island had known since the first raiders ever touched its shore. Now hold on, because here is what almost no one tells you. We are not even certain where this happened. Scholars have argued for a very long time over the true site of the field you're standing in right now. And the nation supposedly born here nearly died within 2 years, when the man counting these kings lay dead himself. So was this the birth of England? Or was it a massacre we later dressed in a crown and called a beginning? Before we go on, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and if you're enjoying the story, hit subscribe. Because what happened next at Brunanburh is one of those moments history almost forgot, and things are about to get intense. To understand how 5 kings ended up dead in a single field, we have to go back. Back before Æthelstan was ever born. Back to a time when the very idea of England did not exist. When this island was a nervous patchwork of frightened kingdoms, and the people who would one day call themselves English were quite simply losing. To measure what Æthelstan achieved, you have to understand how close his people came to disappearing altogether. 2 generations before Brunanburh, the island we now call Britain was not one land. It was a broken chessboard of kingdoms that spoke different languages, worshipped in different ways, and trusted no one beyond their own walls. In the south sat the Saxon kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, and their smaller neighbours, the descendants of settlers who had crossed the sea centuries earlier. In the far north lay the kingdom of Alba, the land of the Scots. Between and around them clustered the Britons of Strathclyde, the Welsh kingdoms in the west, and the old proud half-ruined realm of Northumbria in the northeast. And then, out of the cold sea, came the ships. The great raiding armies of the north arrived within a single lifetime and nearly swallowed everything. In the year 865, a force the chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army landed and did not leave. This was not a raid for silver and slaves and a quick escape. This was conquest. Kingdom after kingdom fell. Northumbria was broken, East Anglia was overrun, its king killed. Mercia was carved apart. One by one, the ancient Saxon crowns were snuffed out, until only one kingdom in all the south still stood, Wessex. And Wessex too came within a hair's breadth of vanishing. Its young king, Alfred, was driven from his own halls, hunted through the marshes, hiding in the wet lowlands with a handful of loyal men while the raiders wintered in his towns. By every measure, the Saxon story should have ended there, in the reeds and the mud forgotten. It did not. Alfred came back. He gathered the survivors, met the northern host in open battle at Edington in the year 878, and won. It was not a total victory. You did not destroy such enemies, you only bought time. But it was enough. Enough to draw a line. The island was divided by treaty into 2 great zones. The south and west remained Saxon. The north and east, a vast stretch of land settled by Norse and Danish warriors, became known as the Danelaw, a country within the island where the raiders had put down their swords and picked up ploughs, but never forgotten the old ways. Alfred spent the rest of his life doing something no Saxon king had done before. He built. He fortified towns, reformed the army, wrote laws, funded learning, and, most important of all, he began to speak of his people not as men of Wessex or Mercia, but as one folk, the English. It was an idea more than a fact, a hope dressed as a kingdom. When Alfred died in the year 899, that hope passed to his son, Edward the Elder, and Edward proved to be a soldier of relentless patience. Year after year he pushed north, taking back the Danelaw fortress by fortress, town by town, until much of the land his father had lost flew Saxon banners again. But an idea is a fragile thing. It lives only as long as the man who carries it, and when Edward the Elder died, that whole trembling dream of one English people, everything Alfred had bled for in the marshes, landed on the shoulders of a single grandson. A young man the old warriors were not at all sure they could trust. His name was Æthelstan, and from the very beginning there was something different about him. The chroniclers tell a story, and here you should keep a careful ear, because the later a story is written down, the more it may have been polished. That when Æthelstan was only a boy, his grandfather Alfred called him forward and dressed him in a scarlet cloak, a belt studded with gems and a small sword worked in gold. It was, they said, a blessing, a recognition, as if the old king had looked at the child and seen, somehow, the man who had finished what he had begun. Whether that scene truly happened or not, one thing is certain. Æthelstan was not raised in Wessex among the men who expected to crown him. He was raised in Mercia, in the court of his aunt, the remarkable Lady of the Mercians, a woman who led armies in her own right. Æthelstan grew up among the Mercians, fought beside them, was loved by them, and that made the great men of Wessex nervous. So when his father died, the succession was not clean. There was resistance. There were rumours and rival claims, whispers that this Mercian-raised prince was not truly one of them. One story even claims a plot to blind him, to make him unfit to rule. It took time before the crown finally firmly sat on his head, and he was consecrated king in the year 925. Once it did, the men who had doubted him learned very quickly what kind of king they had. Because Æthelstan did not merely defend the borders his father and grandfather had drawn, he shattered them. He looked north, at the one great prize no Saxon king had ever truly held, and he took it. That prize was the city of York. York, Jorvik to the Norse who had ruled it for generations, was the beating heart of the Viking North, a wealthy trading city and the seat of a Norse-Irish dynasty with deep roots in Dublin across the sea. It was, for the Northmen, a crown jewel. In the year 927, when its Norse king died, Æthelstan moved with a speed that stunned everyone. He marched north, seized the city, and expelled its rulers, and with that in a single stroke something happened that had never happened before in all the island's history. For the first time, one man ruled every English land from the southern coast to the border of the Scots. The patchwork was gone. The frightened kingdoms were won. Æthelstan began to use a title no king before him had dared to claim, not merely king of the West Saxons, but king of the English. On some of his coins and charters he reached even further, styling himself ruler of all Britain. Later that same year he summoned the other kings of the island to a place in the north called Emont. The king of the Scots came, the king of Strathclyde came, the Welsh princes came, and there, at least in the words of the chroniclers, they all bowed and acknowledged Æthelstan as their overlord. It was the high point of Saxon power, a Saxon king, standing above every other crown on the island. But a bowed head is not a loyal one, and every one of those kings who knelt at Emont went home carrying the same cold thought: this has to be undone. Æthelstan had made himself the greatest king in the island. He had also made himself a target for everyone who was not him. To understand the storm that was coming, you have to meet the men gathering on the other side, because Brunanburh was not a duel. It was the moment when nearly every power that resented Saxon dominance decided to strike at once. The first was Constantine, king of Alba, the second king of the Scots to bear that name, and one of the longest reigning, most cunning rulers of the entire age. Constantine had knelt at Emont, but he was no man's servant. He had spent decades building the young kingdom of the Scots into something stable and strong, and he watched Saxon power swell in the south, with the wariness of a man who knew exactly what an overlord eventually wants: land, tribute, obedience. Constantine had bent the knee once. He did not intend to make a habit of it. The second was a family that burned with a very specific hatred, the Norse dynasty of Dublin, the Sea Kings whose grip stretched across the Irish Sea and who had, until very recently, ruled York itself. When Æthelstan seized that city, he did not just take a town. He tore a jewel from a proud and vengeful line, and now the man who carried that grudge was young, ambitious and dangerous. His name was Olaf Guthfrithson, King of Dublin. To him, York was not lost. York was stolen. And a stolen crown, in the mind of a Norse sea king, is simply a crown waiting to be taken back. The third was Owain, King of Strathclyde, ruler of the Britons who held the wild country in the northwest, a people caught for generations between the Scots and the Saxons, wanting only to survive with their own kingdom intact. For Owain, a Saxon overlord who claimed to rule all Britain was a threat to his very existence. Look at these three men and you see the shape of the coming war: a Scottish king who refused to be ruled, a Norse king who wanted his city back, a British king fighting for the survival of his own people. On their own, each was a serious enemy. Æthelstan had beaten serious enemies before. But what if they stopped fighting each other? That was the nightmare no Saxon king had ever truly faced. For all their centuries of raiding and warring, the peoples of the north had one great weakness: they were divided. Scots fought Norse, Norse fought Britons, Britons fought everyone. Their disunity had, more than any Saxon sword, kept the island's kingdoms alive. The tragedy for Æthelstan was that he himself had become the one thing large enough to unite them. His success was his danger. By rising so high, so fast, he had given every rival a single reason to set aside old hatreds and look south together. And in the years after Aemont, that is exactly what began to happen. Quiet messages, careful marriages, envoys crossing the sea. The slow, patient assembly of the impossible, an alliance of enemies. Alliances are not built out of nothing, they are built out of humiliation. And in the year 934, Æthelstan handed his enemies exactly the humiliation they needed. Something had shifted between the Saxon king and Constantine of Alba. The chroniclers are vague about the cause. Perhaps the Scottish king had broken an oath. Perhaps he had made his own quiet contact with the Norse of Dublin. Perhaps Æthelstan simply decided the northern king had grown too independent. Whatever the reason, Æthelstan did something no Saxon king had ever done. He carried the war deep into Scotland itself, and he did it with overwhelming, deliberate, terrifying force. He did not march north with an army alone. He came with an army and a fleet, land and sea moving together in a single coordinated campaign, a demonstration of power designed to make one point and one point only: that there was nowhere in the island the Saxon king could not reach. His land forces drove far up into the heart of Alba, further than any southern army had gone before, striking at the very core of Constantine's kingdom. At the same time, his ships ranged along the coast, raiding, burning, cutting off escape, ravaging the shoreline settlements. It was total war, waged not to hold territory, but to break a king's pride and force him back to obedience. It worked, for a moment. Constantine, unable to meet such a force in open battle, had no choice. He submitted again. The chroniclers even record that he was made to give up his own son as a hostage, a guarantee of good behaviour handed over to the Saxon court. For Æthelstan, it must have felt like total victory. The northern king humbled twice over, every rival reminded in the harshest possible terms who ruled Britain. But here is the deep and dangerous truth about the year 934, the truth Æthelstan seems not to have understood. You cannot humiliate a proud king into loyalty. You can only humiliate him into hatred. Constantine went home not broken but transformed. The wary neighbour became a determined enemy. A man who had spent his whole life protecting the independence of his kingdom had now been dragged through his own land like a beaten dog, forced to surrender his child, and shown before all his people that his crown was worth nothing while the Saxon lived. He would not make the mistake of facing Æthelstan alone again. If the Saxon king was too strong for any one enemy, then he would face them all. And so, in the shadow of that humiliation, the impossible began to take shape. Old enemies started to talk. The Scots reached across the sea to the Norse of Dublin. Marriage bonds and secret understandings knitted the rivals together. Constantine, the patient king, had found the one thing that could bind Scot and Norseman and Britain into a single fist, a shared and burning need to bring Æthelstan down before he grew any stronger. The trap was being built, and it was aimed at the most powerful king the island had ever known. For 3 years after the humbling of Scotland, the island held its breath. On the surface, Æthelstan reigned in glory. His court was the most splendid in the West. Foreign kings sent him gifts and sought his friendship. His sisters were married into the great royal houses of Europe. Scholars and holy men and exiles came to his hall from across the sea. To the outside world, the Saxon king stood at the summit of his age, unchallenged and secure. Beneath that surface, the enemies he had made were building something monstrous. Think about what had to happen for this alliance to form. These were not natural friends. The Norse of Dublin and the Scots of Alba had spent generations killing one another. The Britons of Strathclyde had reasons to fear both. In the ordinary course of things, they would sooner have gone to war with each other than joined hands. Every instinct, every old wound, every generation of blood between them pulled them apart. And yet, one by one, they came together. The engine of it, most likely, was Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin. Young, energetic, and consumed by his family's claim to York, Olaf was the man with the most to gain and the fire to chase it. He needed a great war to win back his lost city, and he had the ships to carry an army across the sea. Constantine of Alba had the numbers, the fury of his humiliation, and the patient cunning to hold a fragile coalition together. Owain of Strathclyde added his own warriors and his own desperate stake in the outcome. Marriage ties bound the leaders, shared hatred did the rest. By the year 937, the plan was ready. The idea was simple and on paper devastating. Olaf would gather the full strength of the Norse world. The warriors of Dublin, fighters drawn from across the Irish Sea and the Northern Isles, hardened sea raiders and settlers with old scores against the Saxons. He would load them onto a great fleet and cross the water to join the northern kings on the island. Combined, the host of the Scots, the Norse and the Britons would be something the Saxons had never faced. Not a raid, not a border war. An invasion designed to end Saxon dominance forever and carve the island back into its old pieces, with Æthelstan's head as the price of admission. The chroniclers and the later sagas speak of an army of staggering size, tens of thousands of men, a host so large the whole north seemed to be pouring south at once. We should be honest here. The exact numbers are lost, and the figures the old writers give are almost certainly exaggerated, as the numbers in medieval accounts nearly always are. No one recorded a true count. What we can say is that everyone who wrote about it, on both sides, agreed on one thing. This was the greatest army assembled on the island in generations. A coalition of nearly every power that resented the English king, and they had chosen their moment with care. They would strike together from the north into the vast and only loosely held lands Æthelstan ruled, betting that the Saxon king could not gather his own scattered forces in time, betting that his empire, built so fast, would crack under a single hammer blow. The invasion began, the ships came, the northern host marched, and messengers, riding hard and lathered with sweat, raced south to the one man who now had to answer for everything his grandfather had built. Word reached Æthelstan that the storm had broken. The allied host had crossed into his lands and was moving, plundering as it came, a vast column of Scots and Norse and Britons carving through the country. And here we come to one of the strangest and most debated parts of the whole story, because the sources tell us that Æthelstan did not immediately race north to meet them. Some later writers accused him of hesitating, even of allowing the enemy to ravage his territory for a time before he acted. Whether this was true caution, the slow reality of raising an army from a kingdom spread across the whole south of the island, or a deliberate strategy to let the enemy commit fully before striking, we cannot know for certain. The records are thin and the later stories contradict one another. But one thing is clear. When Æthelstan finally moved, he moved with everything he had. He summoned the full strength of the English, men from Wessex, the old heartland of his house, men from Mercia, the people who had raised him and loved him. He fought at the side of his younger brother Edmund, a young man, barely more than a boy, standing beside his king at the head of a nation's whole gathered might. The Saxon host marched north to find the enemy and to settle, in one place and on one day, who would rule the island. They met at a place the chroniclers call Brunanburh, and here we must stop and admit something remarkable, something that reveals just how much time can erase even from the most important events. We do not know where Brunanburh is. For centuries, historians have searched for it. Dozens of sites across the north of the island have been proposed. The leading candidate today, favoured by many scholars, is a place on the Wirral Peninsula in the northwest, near the coast where a great fleet could easily have landed, a location whose old name may preserve an echo of Brunanburh. But nothing is certain. No monument marks the spot. No single field can be proven. The most important battle in the making of England was fought on ground we can no longer point to with confidence. Think about that. The birthplace of a nation, lost. What the sources do give us is the feeling of the thing. Two enormous armies drawn from every corner of the island and the seas around it, facing each other across open ground. On one side, the coalition of kings, the Norse under Olaf, the Scots under Constantine, the Britons under Owain. A mass of warriors who believed they had finally gathered enough strength to break the Saxons for good. On the other, Æthelstan and Edmund and the assembled English, defending not just their lands but the fragile, unproven idea their grandfather had spent his life protecting. There is a Norse saga, written down long after the event, that describes a great battle it calls by a different name, a clash on a wide moor between a Saxon king and a host from the north. Many believe it echoes Brunanburh, but sagas are stories first and history second, shaped and reshaped by generations of tellers, and we cannot lean on them for hard fact. They are best read as the memory of the thing, not the record of it. What is not in doubt is what happened when the two hosts finally met, because on this nameless field, from dawn until the light began to fail, the island's future was decided in the oldest and cruelest way there is, by battle. The two armies closed, and the greatest battle of the age began. We have no detailed account of the tactics, no careful map of who moved where, no minute-by-minute chronicle of the fighting. What the sources preserve instead is something almost more powerful, a sense of scale, of horror, of a struggle that went on, far beyond what men could normally endure. The chroniclers tell us the battle lasted the whole of the day. From the first light of morning until the sun sank in the west, the two hosts hammered against one another without rest. This alone tells you something. Most battles of the age were brutal but short, a matter of hours, sometimes less, before one side broke and ran. Brunanburh did not break. Neither side would yield. Hour after hour the shield walls held, buckled, reformed and held again, two exhausted masses of men grinding against each other in a contest of sheer endurance and will. For the English, everything depended on holding the line. The shield wall was their world, a locked wall of overlapping shields, spears bristling above it, men packed shoulder to shoulder so tightly that to break the formation was to die. Behind those shields stood Æthelstan and his brother Edmund, and behind them stood the whole future of their people. If the wall broke, England, the idea of it, died with them. The coalition threw everything against that wall. The Norse warriors of Olaf, fierce and battle-hardened, the Scots of Constantine fighting with the fury of a humiliated king, the Britons of Owain. Wave after wave came on, and wave after wave was thrown back, and the ground between the armies filled with the fallen. It is here that the monks who kept the records did something extraordinary. When they came to write of this day, they abandoned their usual dry, factual style entirely. They broke into a great poem, one of the most famous pieces of writing to survive from the entire era, a work that sang of the long day's slaughter, of the field of battle darkened, of blades that grew weary in the hands that held them, of the pursuit that followed. They wrote of it not as a mere event, but as something that would be remembered for as long as the island stood. That, more than any number, tells you what this day meant to the people who lived through it. It broke through their reserve, it forced them into song, and slowly, through that endless day, the tide began to turn. The English wall did not break, the coalitions did. Somewhere in the grinding hours, the great alliance of kings began to give way. Perhaps the discipline of the Saxon and Mercian veterans told at last. Perhaps the sheer will of two brothers fighting for everything proved greater than the will of allies, who in their hearts still did not fully trust one another. Whatever the cause, the invaders' line cracked, and once it cracked, it collapsed. The proud host that had come south to break the Saxons broke instead, and what followed the breaking was by every account the most terrible part of the day, because when a shield wall shatters and men turn to run, the killing does not stop. It multiplies. The English pursued the fleeing coalition across the country as the light died, cutting down the scattered and the exhausted. The chroniclers say the pursuit went on until the very end of the day, the field and the roads leading from it filled with the dead of the north. By the time darkness fell, the greatest army the island had ever seen was simply gone. When the fighting finally ended, the scale of what had happened became clear, and it was staggering. The great poem preserved by the chroniclers gives us the grim accounting. 5 kings, it says, lay dead upon the field, laid to sleep by the sword, along with 7 of Olaf's earls, his great warlords, the pillars of his host. We should be careful here. These kings were almost certainly lesser rulers and princes of the coalition rather than the 3 great leaders themselves, and the tally comes to us through a poem written to glorify a victory, not a neutral ledger. But even allowing for that, the meaning is unmistakable. The leadership of the invading host had been gutted. An entire generation of northern nobility died in a single day. Among the dead was a figure who mattered enormously, the son of Constantine of Alba, the old Scottish king who had gambled everything on this war, who had bound together an alliance of ancient enemies to bring Æthelstan down, watched his own child fall on that field. The chroniclers note it with quiet, devastating weight. Constantine, they say, had no cause to boast of the meeting of swords. He had lost his son, his warriors, his gamble and his pride all in one day. He fled north, an old man returning to a kingdom that had bled itself nearly white for nothing. Olaf Guthfrithson, the young sea king who had dreamed of winning back York, survived. He escaped to his ships with the shattered remnant of his host and sailed back across the sea to Dublin, his great army destroyed, his invasion in ruins. The dream of a Norse North, of a coalition ruling the island, sank into the mud of Brunanburh behind him. The losses on both sides were enormous. This was not a clean victory. The English too paid a fearful price. The poem mourns their own dead, and Æthelstan's kingdom was left exhausted by the effort. Battles of this kind did not spare the winners. Victory simply meant that more of the other side lay on the field than of your own. When the chroniclers called it the bloodiest day the island had known since the first invaders arrived, they were not exaggerating for effect. They meant it. And yet, for all that horror, the outcome was total. The coalition that had gathered to destroy Saxon England was annihilated as a fighting force. Its kings were dead or fleeing. Its army was gone. The one great combined effort of Scot, Norse and Britain to break the English king had failed, and failed so utterly that no such alliance would ever be assembled against him again. Æthelstan and Edmund had done it. They had faced the largest hostile army the island had ever produced, an alliance of nearly every rival power around them, and they had won. The 2 brothers marched south again as the victors of the age, their reputation now beyond challenge. The Saxon king who had crowned himself ruler of all Britain had, at last, proven it in the only court that truly mattered in that world, the field of battle. But here is the question that lingers over the whole grim triumph. What exactly had all that death purchased? A victory, yes. Survival, yes. But was it the birth of a nation, or only the survival of one man's claim, bought at a price that beggars the imagination? The answer would not become clear for a very long time, and it would come at a terrible cost. Here is the cruelest irony of Brunanburh. The man who won it did not live to enjoy what he had won. Just 2 years after his greatest triumph, Æthelstan died. He was not an old man. He had crushed the coalition of kings, stood at the summit of the island, made himself the most respected ruler in the West, and then, with shocking suddenness, he was gone, leaving his young brother Edmund to inherit the crown. And almost at once, everything he had bled for began to come apart, because the enemies of Brunanburh had been beaten, but not erased. Olaf Guthfrithson, the sea king who had fled the field, was still alive in Dublin, and the moment he heard that the great Æthelstan was dead, he moved. He crossed the sea again, and this time there was no Æthelstan to stop him. Within a short time of the old king's death, Olaf had seized back the very prize he'd gone to war for. York was his once more. The unified island, the great achievement of Æthelstan's reign, cracked straight down the middle. Think about what that means. If you had asked in the years right after Brunanburh whether England had truly been born there, the honest answer would have been, not yet. The victory had not made the unity permanent. It had only proven it was possible. The work would have to be done again and again by the kings who came after, Edmund and those who followed him, fighting for decades more to hold together what Brunanburh had so briefly welded. So why do we still call Brunanburh the birth of England? Why does a battle whose site we cannot even find, whose gains were half lost within 2 years, hold such an enormous place in the story of a nation? Because Brunanburh was not the birth of England as a fixed and finished thing. It was the birth of England as an idea that could not be killed. Before that day, the notion of one English kingdom was a hope, a claim, a title on a coin. It had never been tested against the full, combined might of everyone who opposed it. At Brunanburh, it was tested in the most extreme way imaginable, the whole of the hostile north thrown against it at once, and it survived. The English did not fight that day as men of Wessex or Mercia. They fought as one people, under one king, defending one country, and they won. From that day forward, no one could say the idea was merely a Saxon fantasy. It had been proven in blood. It had a founding moment to look back to. That is why the monks broke into poetry. That is why the memory of Brunanburh outlived the memory of its own location. The battle became a story a nation could tell itself about where it came from. A day when a young king and his brother stood against impossible odds and refused to let their people be scattered back into the dust. So we return, at the end, to the man walking through the field of dead kings. Was Æthelstan a hero, the founder of England, the grandson who finished what Alfred began? Or was he something harder to name, a king so ambitious that he provoked the very war that nearly destroyed everything, who bought his nation's founding with a river of blood on a field we can no longer find, and who died before he could see whether any of it would last? Perhaps he was both. Perhaps that is what the birth of a nation always is, not a clean and glorious beginning, but a desperate, costly, half-remembered day when a fragile idea refused to die. The ravens rose from Brunanburh, and the field went quiet. And out of that silence something new began to take shape. Not a battle won, a nation beginning to believe in itself. And that, in the end, may be the only kind of birth history ever truly gives us.